Testing, testing. Check, check. 1, check. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Just got our wonderful colleagues at the back who are setting up live streaming. So we'll just, while that's happening, for the people who aren't on live stream, they don't need to know, but you do. If there is a fire alarm, it will be a real fire alarm, and you can see there the green person run out the door and to the right, and we'll be outside and take instructions from there. Toilets are around there, and colleagues here can help to guide you. I think that's all for housekeeping. Lana, okay. Right. So we are now live streaming, so hello to everybody on the live stream, and hello to this full house here at Cambridge. Thank you so much to everybody for coming on this freezing cold day in February, where are we? January still.
Still January.
Still January just. And thank you in particular for our panel who have come from far and wide. And I think it's a really exciting discussion that we're going to be having today. So Lisbeth Steer has been working with the Education Commission report now for about 1.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea was born some sort of, I guess, almost 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. When was that at the Norway big meeting? Oslo Summit. When was that, Olav?
1.5 years.
It seems it's only
It's a long time ago. So there was a big Oslo summit when one of the, I think probably the biggest idea that came out of that was the need for an education commission that would really galvanise support behind education. Because I'm sure that everybody in this room believes that education is at the core of development. But unfortunately, a lot of people outside of this room don't necessarily think so. So Lisbeth and a team of people have been preparing a report to help influence, with evidence, people outside of this room, including ministers of finance, including heads of state and others. So Lisbeth will be telling us more about the report shortly. And then we have a panel of people who are all from organisations that also believe that evidence is central to policy. Now, it's sometimes a bit more complicated in translating evidence into policy, and we might be hearing a bit about that from our colleagues as well. But I think given the intention of the report to not just be something to sit on the shelf, but to influence people in organisations like DFID, the World Bank, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, as well as national governments around the world, it's going to be really interesting to hear from other colleagues as well. So maybe if we start with Lisbeth, and then I'll introduce our other speakers who are going to provide some of their perspectives. So Lisbeth, if you would like to.
So, do I use something to move the slide?
So there is a, yeah.
yeah. Do I have to speak through this? Great. Okay. So I'll try not to move around too much. So thank you so much, Pauline. Thank you all in this room for coming today. We're really excited today, but also this year, to be honest, and last year, because we feel there is a moment that presents itself to really increase attention to education. And maybe some of those in the room here who were around maybe 1 or 2 decades ago when we had the big education summits and conferences, I'd be interested to see whether you feel there is a sort of a swelling of attention, which we really need. We have the Education Commission that was set up, as Pauline said, to really put education on the agenda. We noticed in the last few years that education was losing its way a little bit. It was set against big global problems such as climate change, health pandemics, and so on. And we were struggling to make the case that education needs to be paid attention to. So the Commission was an effort to make sure that we were getting attention at the highest political levels, and not just by talk and opinion, but by evidence. That is again something where education really needs to make sure it stands up against other sectors who've been very successful at using hard data and evidence to make the case to policymakers that there's need for change, that there's need for more investment. And I say we are at a special moment because we have the Commission, but we also have centers like REAL that have been set up, that are growing. We have the World Development Report on education. We have the SDGs that are now in play. We have a big program by DFID that's called RISE that is trying to look at system reform. We have the Norwegian government that is putting more and more attention to this issue. And we are, to be frank, in a global context where education can no longer be ignored. If we look at the refugee crisis currently ongoing, if we look frankly at the political crises both in the United States where I am based and also in Europe, if we think about all of this, it all points back to education. Inequality in the world really at its heart goes to have people equal, do people have equal opportunity? So it's an important moment, and I hope we can get you all excited to come along with us, because we are a movement. We're not a report. We are a movement that is here for change. So how am I going to move this? No? Did I point it somewhere? Okay, good. So here are our commissioners. This is an incredible cast of people. The chair of the commission is Gordon Brown, who you will probably know. He has been working on education for a long time. He is an incredible force and makes sure that we don't sleep, basically. We need to keep moving and need to keep pushing. But we have, at the same time, also our co-conveners, which comprise of the Prime Minister of Norway, heads of states of various developing countries, Irena Bokova of UNESCO, and then a combination of private sector leaders, academic leaders, people from government and from the donor community, all trying to make the case and move things forward. So the report was launched last year. We've actually been at it for about 1.5 years, and sometimes we think about it and we sort of surprised because it's a very short period of time. The report was launched in September. It's called The Learning Generation. That's not a coincidence because, as you will all know in this room, we've been pretty successful at getting children into school in the last decade. But the real problem is what are these kids doing? And what are they learning? What skills are they coming out with? Again, this is incredibly important because, as the report states, the technological change that we are facing today, where, in reports, it is estimated that about 2 billion jobs are at risk of disappearing in the next few years. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be any other jobs. No, there will be new jobs coming into play that require often higher level skills and different skills. So skills are going to be incredibly important for people to be able to participate in the labor market, participate in society. And what we estimated with the Commission, based on projections, was that by 2030, about half of the world's youth will not be on track to achieve basic secondary level skills. And we can go into the sort of technicalities of this, but this was done by a team of people who've done a lot of this work in the past, and actually also working with people in this room. I don't seem to have a very good way of moving this. So here is another slide that just sort of indicates how difficult things are and what we're facing in terms of sort of trends of where people will be in the next few decades if we keep going at the trends we are at today. So we need to have a massive change in terms of how we do things, and we need to accelerate progress, because we cannot end up by 2050 with only about 40% of sub-Saharan African children on track to complete secondary education. So these, I'll go through this quite quickly, but you can look in the report. We've made a lot of projections about where we will be at in terms of skills at primary and at secondary level in the next few years. We spend a lot of time also thinking about what the implications of this would be, what the impact of it would be on growth, on economic growth, what the impact would be on inequality, what the impact would be on health outcomes and fertility rates. And I won't go through all these statistics, but you know also, having worked on this, that there is a huge impact on this. And as also the Global Monitoring Report this year showed, education is at the heart of all the SDGs. So it's really worth paying attention to. Now, what do we propose in the report? The report is really trying to come up with a roadmap and a vision that leaders can stand behind. Now, we have the SDGs. We have a really great set of SDGs, but what we try to do in the Commission is actually use existing evidence to try and see what the path could be to achieving the SDGs. Now, as you all know, the SDGs are incredibly ambitious. And even though we would love it that by 2030 everybody is in school and has access to higher education and primary and secondary and is learning, it may be slightly too ambitious for some countries. But what we say is, if all countries were able to move at the pace of the 25% fastest improvers, and we actually controlled for initial conditions, so it's not trying to compare or put a sort of measure of the best countries or the richest countries necessarily. But if we look at that and we look at the 25% and we apply that rate of progress to other countries, we could achieve the learning generation by in the next generation, and that's by 2030, 2040. For some countries it will be 2040, and in the report it kind of sets out what we mean by this. We looked at access to early childhood, we looked at primary education access and learning, secondary access and learning, and then also access to higher education. So this is in a very quick sort of way saying what this learning generation is and what that vision includes. And then we spent some time trying to look at what the impact of the learning generation would be. And again, these are things that you probably have seen in many publications and in work that you've done yourself in terms of earnings, impact on health outcomes, and so on. So what the Commission then says is, in order to achieve this learning generation, we need a financing compact. Now, that is a compact in which, first of all, countries agree to reform and invest. So, and I will come back to the reform aspect of this because it's very important. Secondly, the international community comes alongside these countries if they do make that commitment and they do follow up on the commitment. And then thirdly, there is an accountability system, a global accountability that is connected to this compact. Now, the compact, we say in the report, is realized through 4 transformations. The first one is performance, the second is innovation, third inclusion, and fourth is finance. And the first 3 of these, actually, we are called the Financing Commission, but the first 3 of these actually are not called finance. And often people come to us and say, but you are a Financing Commission, why are you talking about performance and innovation and inclusion? That has nothing to do with finance. You should just be focusing on number 4. What we say in the report is no, we need to use existing resources much more effectively and efficiently, because if we don't, first of all, we won't achieve what we're trying to achieve, but also we're not nowhere close to making the case for more finance. If we can't make sure that we have better outcomes, that we can demonstrate those outcomes, that we can use the most innovative ways of getting there, we are not going to make the case. Ministers of finance, ministers of donors, countries are not interested, I'm afraid to say, and we are up against other sectors who are doing this quite effectively. So in addition to these 4 sort of big transformations that we propose, we have 12 recommendations, and they're quite concrete around the performance, making sure results are front and center. This is all about measurement of learning outcomes and how we're doing. It's about investing in the right things and using evidence to make decisions, and it's about cutting inefficiencies and addressing some pretty poor results at the moment in terms of, as you know, teachers turning up at work, use of textbooks, and all these things that have that we've looked at and that people in this room have studied for so long. That needs to be addressed really at its core. And this was one of the biggest discussions in the Commission meeting, because when we first met, they said, look, we can talk about all the finance that you want, but if we're not addressing the efficiency, if we don't cut waste, that was what they were talking about, we need to cut waste. People like government ministers who were part of it, people from the private sector, that was one of the things that they felt most strongly about. So that's what we emphasized very much in the report. Innovation. When we think about innovation, everybody thinks about technology, obviously. Technology will play a big role. But we actually wanted to emphasize innovation in 2 other areas. One is the workforce. We've tended to focus in education on teachers, rightly so. Teachers are incredibly important. We need to professionalize the teaching workforce. We need to grow the teaching workforce. But what we may not have paid enough attention to is how that workforce needs to change as a whole. Not just the teachers, but also the support staff and the people who are kind of living and working around the teachers to support the education system. We looked at some data. The health sector keeps data of all the roles that are in the health sector. If you go on the WHO website, you have a whole list of professional roles within the health sector. Now, that doesn't speak only about doctors. It speaks about lab assistants and nurses and assistants and so on and so on. Every role is described and has a professional flavor to it. In education, we could not find, even the people who've worked in this for years and years, it was very difficult to find that kind of distinction. What are the different roles that we have? If we have technology entering the education sector, is that going to change the role of teachers? And what is the role of teachers? And what should they be doing versus other types of roles that are there? So we recommended to establish a task force to look at this issue. It actually already exists in health, interestingly. They launched a report last year I think the Norwegians were engaged in this as well. It was a commission on the health workforce. We need to talk about an education workforce, not just about teachers. And then we have the issue of non-state actors, which we could go into a little bit as well. I'll mention inclusion because we're going to talk about it later. It's obviously incredibly important. The Commission recommends here to both think about cross-sectoral investment to address inequalities, but also to think about progressive universalism, and Pauline will say some words about that. So on financing, finally, when we think about if we've done all this, we can talk about more finance, because we do need more finance. We need to expand, and we need to expand both the domestic side and we need to expand the international side. We recommend, in terms of the domestic side, there's a number of recommendations there with respect to tax mobilization and better use of taxation. On the international side, the key point we're making there is, yes, we need to increase ODA and we need to ask donors to do more. But to be honest, in this day and age where donors are constrained and where the demands of the SDGs are so huge that the grant finance is just not going to get us close enough to where we need to be. So we need to start thinking about how we can use the banking system, the multilateral banking system, in a more effective way to also inject finance where appropriate. It's not saying that all countries should now be taking up loans, but where appropriate, we should emphasize both the concessional and the non-concessional finance of the multilateral banks, and they could do more in this. So we're at our phase 2 now, which is really the most important phase to us. We spent a lot of time thinking and writing, but this is what we are all about. We're a commission that wants to change, and what we are doing right now is we're working with pioneer countries who are taking up the recommendations of saying they want to really implement the recommendations and are developing a kind of roadmap for this. We are working on establishing the multilateral investment mechanism, which has to do with this banking system and making sure that the multilateral banks can do the best they can. And then thirdly, we're working on strengthening global accountability. So we can go into, and I don't want to go, how many more minutes do I have, Pauline? Okay, fine. So I can spend 2 seconds on this. So what we've been doing is our commissioners, including actually President Kikwete, the former president of Tanzania, have been visiting heads of state in different countries and are still doing this to present the recommendations of the Commission and to ask them to make education a national priority. Not in a way, in some countries, education is already quite high on the agenda, but we want to have a change in approach. And we can talk a little bit about this because what we say in the report is we need to start looking at the results and working backwards from that to where the change is needed. Many of the sector plans and many of the governments so far have tended to have an incremental approach to sector planning. They take plans, they expand the sector, they put more teachers in, they put more schools in. And what we're saying is we actually need a new approach to this. We need an evidence-based approach to getting the results, identifying the barriers, and so on. President Kikwete is a really wonderful example of this. When he was in office, he felt that he wasn't getting any grip on the education sector. He had no idea what was going on. The education minister was occasionally updating him, but he felt that he wasn't really able to understand what was going wrong and to take action. So what he did was, and this actually was in collaboration with the World Bank and DFID, he launched a program called Big Results Now. What that did is it brought different parties of both government and private sector together to talk about where do we want to go as a country, where do we want to be with our education system, not just with the education ministry, but also with other ministries. And because it came from the president's office, they were able to break out of the sort of normal way of doing things. they came up with a plan that became the basis for a program that then was developed in subsequent years. And maybe Lewis or Rachel can talk a little more about this. It was incredibly successful. They had a delivery unit in the presidential office that made weekly reports of what was going on in the education sector. The monitoring was done in a meticulous way. What is going on? Are we addressing the different problems we've identified? And there was a reporting back to the president on weekly basis, on monthly basis, and then they had a quarterly meeting where they brought people together. It was a dramatic change of doing things. He recognizes that himself, and also his ministries recognize that. The program has been evaluated as being very effective, and so that kind of flavor, whether obviously every program will have its downsides and there will be problems with it, but I think it's the flavor that we want to bring into planning processes and implementation in other countries as well. So we are working together with countries to think about how they could maybe look at this kind of approach and come up with a plan to achieve the learning generation objectives. We're also working on an MDB mechanism, as I mentioned earlier. And what this is trying to do is to bring together the banks. And I think this will be fairly new because the banks, both the World Bank and the regional banks, have tried to work together, but it hasn't always worked. And education may well become the sector where they will try and look at this issue much more carefully. The World Bank has done quite a bit in education. Other banks, the regional banks, Inter-American Bank is quite active. The African Bank is not very active for a region that is incredibly important. The question is there, why is the African Development Bank not doing more in education? So there needs to be a coordination around between the banks about the prioritization of education. But then there needs to also be an effort to both increase concessional and non-concessional finance. And we're developing proposals to make that happen. This has two sides to it. There are demand-side issues. Are countries actually asking the banks for more resources? And there are supply-side issues. Does the bank have enough resources to offer to countries? And we are looking at both of those issues. And the demand side, in particular when you start looking at lower middle income countries where the biggest resources will be needed as we move into the 2020s, because low income countries are moving into lower middle income status. A lot of the actually financing issues will happen in these transition countries, so we need to see how we're going to help them. We have ODA, we have GPE to address those low-income countries, but what are we doing with these countries who are moving out of this important group, and how do we help them? So that's the proposal there. And then on the accountability side, we feel there is, obviously the SDG framework is incredibly important. We need to look at the outcomes. But is there a way that we also could actually map a little more effectively what is going on in countries in terms of the reform efforts they are taking? And that's where the idea of a dashboard came from. Are there ways that we could come up with some kind of index or a dashboard or indicators that are being tracked on an ongoing basis to see how are countries doing when we look at these 12 recommendations and the 4 transformations? How are they doing? What are countries doing in that area? It has both the benefit of tracking, but it also has the benefit of identifying who's doing well and what could we learn from different countries. I won't go into it a lot because I think that's really what we're going to try and tease out in the discussion as well, and we can come back to it later. So I think that's, maybe I'll leave it here. Shall I, Pauline? Because I want to turn it over to you all to talk a little more about this. Great.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that really sort of incisive but really key presentation of a load of work that's taken a lot of people a lot of time. And as we can see, and as Lisbeth was saying at the beginning, this isn't just a report, it's a movement, and it's great to see that things are moving. So there is a lot going on. I should say that I think Lisbeth this week has been on a whistle-stop tour. She won't tell us where she's been, but she might tell you over a coffee later. So it's great that she's part of her whistle-stop tour has been to come here with us at Cambridge. And maybe just to say why I think part of the reason why the Commission has come here to Cambridge is that we have actually worked quite closely with colleagues on the report. So there are people in the audience here who have provided some of the background research. And as Lisbeth was mentioning, we have a particular passion on one of the 4 of the recommendations areas on inclusion and specifically around progressive universalism. So my point is always that that should be at the forefront and the centre of anything that the Commission is doing. So that should be the number 1, and everything else on financing, innovation, etc. comes from that if we're really going to have a learning generation within this period that we're looking at. So the work that we've done, just to say very briefly, there's some copies, a copy of the paper at the back so you can flick through, it's on the website, on the Education Commission website, has been about the need for progressive tax, needing to expand the tax base in the first place. We need more resources. Most of those resources are going to come from domestic governments to make sure that those taxes are collected in a way that are hitting the rich more than the poor. Most countries, in the poorest countries, it's the other way around. The poorest are paying more money, and the poorest are also getting less in terms of the spending on the education system. So we also need to reverse that. So it's progressive tax, progressive spending to achieve progressive results. So I think that was our overarching message from the work that we did, which I think hopefully had some
incredibly useful.
some use in the report. And I think just to link that, we were having a discussion actually with some people from the governments in Tanzania and Ethiopia on the big results now, so on this Tanzania programme. And one of the interesting things that Ethiopia raised to Tanzania was, but what was the issue around equity? How did focusing on results make sure that you were actually focusing on the most marginalised? And I'm not sure that from Tanzania we had the answer as yet. Not to say that it hasn't had a positive effect, but in terms of looking at the evidence when you are focusing on results, who is really benefiting and who might get missed out. So I think really, really great to have that oversight. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hear from our 3 panellists, and then we will open up for discussion. And just to say that for those on the live stream, I have my Twitter feed here. So if you tweet to #LearningGeneration, we can pick up the tweets. And for those in the room, do also tweet to the hashtag. And we will then, if there are questions on the live stream, can also put those to the panellists as well. So I think, Rachel, if we maybe start with you. Rachel Hinton is the head of the education research team at the UK Department for International Development. And I work closely with Rachel because I actually spend a day a week in DFID as Senior Research Fellow. And I have to say that I think Rachel heads one of the most dynamic teams in DFID. Not only are they doing really important work in terms of evidence, but over a very small period of time, the amount of funding that has gone to education research in DFID has increased exponentially. Not to say that it's still the tip of the iceberg, still far more needs to be done, but it is amazing to see what transformation there has been. And I think others would agree that DFID really is an important player in the landscape of looking at the links between evidence and policy. So I'll just get the PowerPoint up. So that's the video. Okay, you could come and shout when you want it. So you could just, yeah.
Great. Well, it's a real honour to be here today, actually, because it was in 2012 when I think many of you know Rebecca Thornton from Brookings, who said, we really aren't investing enough in education. She estimated it was 10 times less in education than in health. And I think that's probably a great underestimation, actually. But I think this call from the Commission to do more and invest more is huge, and it's really important. I'm very fortunate in DFID that we actually have an allocated minimum 3% that the UK government has said we should be spending on research. And that's a real privilege that we have that earmarking. And yet, we still have challenges. And I wanted to discuss today a few of the challenges that I think are faced by us in the education sector around not just the use of evidence, but also in the production of that evidence. So this is just a little graphic for you. So of those three challenges, I think the first is that a lot of the research studies are at the micro level, small scale studies that don't necessarily then translate to learning impacts when you scale up. And I'm seeing stir here in the audience. They're one of the organisations that are really trying to shift the game and are trying to actually do experimental work at scale, and it's hugely difficult. But all credit to those who are moving into that space. The second is that there's been a prevalence of qualitative over quantitative research, but again that is shifting. But we don't have as many high impact journals as we do in other sectors, and that I think really hinders the amount of debate in the public media, both here in the UK, internationally, and at a national level. And so we welcome the focus on that, and maybe we could discuss that with those of you in the audience later. And thirdly, we actually don't have enough of a body of evidence. So we've found that in DFID, when we were trying to do some systematic reviews, that actually we had insufficient evidence in any one particular topic that we were interested in to do that. And those of you, many of you here have actually helped us with some of these reviews. And we ended up having to do them as rigorous literature reviews. So really, there is a massive need for us just to be doing more in more places. So, moving on next. It isn't just DFID, it's a shared mission. It's a common mission to get better evidence for policy making. And so much so that in 2013, a whole group of us came together and said, actually, let's pool our resources, let's come together and think about what we can do jointly, what we can commission jointly, but also how we can up the game in terms of gold standards of research in qualitative and quantitative methods, how we can put out shared guidelines. And this has been a real momentum for lots of new work. And the RISE programme, for example, the research into systems of education that was mentioned by Lisbeth, is one nice example of where partners are coming together and actually jointly funding this work, headed by Lant Pritchard, who's doing an amazing job at galvanising people who perhaps didn't traditionally work in education to come into education. And the Ethiopia bid is a wonderful example also of having the very best researchers on kind of quantitative side and qualitative side coming together as well. And what's different about this research is that it's trying to work with governments from the outset to do research really in a very different way. However, I'd like to ask, given the question of the title I was given to talk to, putting evidence to work, I think one of the biggest challenges is actually that each of these cogs can operate quite nicely and quite independently, thank you very much. Each of these has its own incentive system, or as Paul Collier said at a lecture a couple of weeks ago, that actually there are separate narratives with separate incentives. And we have, so the donors, it's about their own national, our own MDGs. We have our own targets to deliver, and I could, quite easily do lots of projects within DFID, separate. The policymakers have their own different incentives around national plans, around their elections, around making sure the press get out certain stories. And academics have the publication record as being a really key driver. So what can we do about that? The UK has done quite a bit recently with the new REF system of actually giving incentives to academics and giving credit for those who actually do have this interaction between the policymakers and the academics. But I think there's a long way yet to go on that. I think the other challenge we have is that there's a group of people who want adaptive learning, so want that evidence to influence the policy and the program straight away. And on the other hand, for an academic, particularly perhaps with an experimental method, they don't want any adaptation over here in the intervention because it would spoil the study and the research. And how do we deal with these kind of tensions in the environment? And as I said, it's very easy. A lot of donors now have put evidence at the heart of their work. It's actually mandatory now in DFID to make sure that you're using evidence at every stage. It's quite easy to do that if you're doing that for your own program. Are we using evidence well enough, though, when we're wanting to look at the bigger picture? And this question that was raised by the Commission is the balance of resources to one sector over another. Is that right? Is that appropriate? Is education getting the share of resource it should? And is that evidence-based? And then perhaps most difficult, I think, is how do we influence actually what's happening in governments with much more complexity around the information they've got. Very often in academia, we have a sort of deficit model of information, but in the reality for decision makers in these countries is that they're getting bombarded with all kinds of information. And why should they listen to one international academic over another? And so I just wanted to give one last example to you of the Young Lives programme that I think's done a really fabulous job of actually trying to ensure these cogs that I showed you earlier actually do interact. And at the heart of that is actually the relationships that they've developed. So they really have local academics with respect and trust inside government. They have deep and long relationships. They have international experts who also have respect. But it isn't an easy task, and I don't think we always place enough value on the local researchers. A lot of the money doesn't tend to flow down to the national level. And so I think we need to look at the success stories of where evidence does influence policy and learn from that around why has that worked. So just to leave you with this.
So Rachel is testing our technology.
The study, which was set up at the beginning of the millennium, was intended to provide long-term research evidence to really understand the changing nature of childhood poverty in order to really help shape much more effective policies and programs.
It follows the life of 12,000 children in 4 developing countries over a period of 15 years.
Each one of those countries being a very different stage of development with very different structural, economic constraints and opportunities.
Is trying to double the number of children going to the first grade of preschool very rapidly in 5 years. And so we've been able to help by bringing in evidence from the international community to suggest how this rapid expansion can be done without losing quality and without the system being undermined by a very rapid expansion.
Thank you, Rachel. I think it's great to see the sort of that interaction between evidence and policy. And I think if you don't know the Young Lives programme, I would really recommend you look at the website. It's a huge amount of resources, great data, which we have also had the opportunity to use, and also for the Education Commission, in fact. So I think sort of that's a really good example of the links. And very exciting to see Alula Pankhurst there, who we are hopefully going to be working together with on the RISE Ethiopia programme. So that's the Education Systems Research in Ethiopia. So some continuity of Young Lives with RISE as well. So I'm now going to turn to Olav Sim, who is the Policy Director for Education at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Olav is known to many of us for, I think, being working in education in a variety of roles for many years. Olav used to be down the corridor. I used to be down the corridor from Olav in UNESCO, so we often used to have lunch and put the world to rights. And haven't quite made it yet. That's why we need the Education Commission report. And I have to say, sort of, I had an experience of Olav and David Edwards, for those of you who know David Edwards, who is the head of Education International, who did the most wonderful chairing of an event in Norway. And I think I think we should. The outcome of that was that we needed the Olav David Roadshow for chairing events. So I think at some point for the Education Commission, you should bring them in.
That's great.
But Olav, I think on a more serious note, it would be great to hear your thoughts in relation to the issues that we're discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pauline, and it's really great to be here because I really remember our luncheons in Paris at the 7th floor of the UNESCO building overlooking Paris and having deep conversations about the future of education. And at least for me, meeting a academic, strong researcher perspective was really putting things in perspective. And I think we've come some way since then. I think there are interesting things happening. I got back to the ministry. I was very lucky with my timing. I got back just after a change of government in Norway, where a declaration of the new government was really to become a global leader in education, and the other one was to double our support to education within this parliamentary period, which is a 4-year period. We'll manage to do this year actually. We managed to double our support. I think on the global leadership part, I think the jury is still out, but we're trying as good as we can.
Pretty good job.
But what was quite interesting was when we sort of approached this, we tried to take some lessons from health, because we had some quite success in sort of managing at least to increase donor funding from health. And so that was, and we were put together in a section called a Global Initiative, which basically was health and education. So we tried to take some lessons from our health colleagues, and what came out very strongly from the start was that the health community has been much better in sort of, first of all, documenting results, which is critical. But I've also been sort of much stronger in the sort of building the global public goods in health, which has been critical in terms of getting the acceptance for investment in health. I think that the third experience was very much in line with the recommendation of the Commission, is that if you're really going to have some impact at the country level, you need to engage heads of state and the top political level. And I used to work in UNESCO, sort of heading the Education for All coordination, and we had a real big challenge, because I think we were able to get the ministers of education together, and they usually all agreed, but getting beyond the education was always a big challenge, and at least we felt a bit uncomfortable trying to sort of, we were criticized all the time, particularly by civil society, that we were not able to sort of reach beyond the education sector. And I think this is why we also learned from some of the work in health on that establishing a commission can have a big impact in terms of really engaging interest. And of course, Gordon was also quite active, because there wasn't that many donors at that time that showed interest in education. I think, to be frank, Norway was the only country at that time that were scaling up our support to education. So I think it was quite easy for Gordon to come to Norway and say that he was willing to help us in this. So I think we managed quite well so far. There are some challenges ahead. We have to be realistic in terms of the sort of global political landscape at the moment.
Yeah.
But at least we're trying to do our best in terms of facilitating the process. From us, it's been very clear that the report and the Commission is independent, and I think that's critical, that it's now up to the commissioners really to take the recommendations of the report forward, and really trying to convince heads of states I understand former President Kikwete is doing a wonderful job now, at least on the African region, in terms of mobilizing support from some of the. I think we will continue to support this work. We're also going to have a general election in September, so things are a bit up in the open at the moment. But it's been quite interesting that support for education in Parliament is very strong. And what has been quite unique about this government, they managed to, the former government, which is a social democrat government, really highlighted health, global health was the number one political priority. I think this government managed to keep up support and even increasing support through health, and at the same time building up education, which I think has been quite successful, and also galvanizing support in Parliament. And so I don't expect any big changes regardless of the outcome of the election in September. But I think we committed to support the Secretariat of the Commission till October or something, because that's how long we are in a sort of able to do this, because there will be a new government, or there might not be a new government, but we'll see. But at least from my perspective, and sort of particularly working with health colleagues, I've made some reflections on some similarities, but also some differences between how the two sectors approach this. And it's been quite fun sometimes to work with our colleagues, because my health colleagues always brag about results. Education, when we are as education specialists, we have a lot to show. We have made fantastic results, but still we tend to say all the time, we've done well, but we could have done much better. I think there's something that needs to be this sort of changed in terms of mentality, really highlighting the successes, and I think it's a bit narrow to just focus on sort of donor ODA support. If you really look into what countries themselves are putting into the sectors, and particularly in terms of system building, I think education is far beyond the health sector in terms of system building. So I think the picture is quite nuanced, and there are some interesting things happening now with the focus on results-based financing. I think you might pick up on that, but I'm happy to see my old friend Keith Luan in the audience, because we organized a conference last year in Oslo on leaving no one behind in education, and everybody was bragging about this results-based approach. And Keith had a short intervention and really sort of managed to shift that. This is fine, but you have to be a bit cautious on sort of jumping on these new approaches. And I think that's one of the basic challenges we're facing in education, realizing that education at a national level is very political in nature. It's the prerogative of every government to decide what education system they want to develop. And it's a challenge, because they are obliged to stand by the human rights commitments to provide quality education to every citizen. But it's a bit up to them to decide how to do it. And I think it's still the right of the parents to decide what sort of education they want for their children. So I think this is exciting work, and I look forward to continue working with you.
Thank you. So thank you, Oliver. I think the message, Lisbeth, is that Norway wants big results now from the Education Commission, and before the next election, please. So now I'm going to turn to our last panellist, Luis Benveniste, who is the Practice Manager for Education, Global Education Engagement and Knowledge at the World Bank. Grand title, doing grand things. As many of you know, World Bank has a sort of very long history of doing very high quality research and education, and I think something that has driven a lot of other agencies to support, and I know that other agencies work closely with the World Bank as well on sort of evidence building. And as we heard earlier, one of the things that's coming up on the landscape next year, I believe, is the World Development Report on education. So we are keeping the momentum going. So over to Luis to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here, and it's great to be here at Cambridge, so thank you for hosting us, Pauline. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the sort of bringing evidence to work, bringing it to the field, and how, and what does that mean in relation to financing, and how all of this needs to be sort of a marriage of interest that sort of works harmoniously. So I think that first of all, it's important to sort of think through sort of, if we're going to finance results, like the big results now in Tanzania, I think that it's important to sort of first tease out that there are different types of mechanisms by which you can finance results. There's output-based aid, there's conditional cash transfers, there is pay for performance, there is cash on delivery. All of these are somewhat different types of instruments that work with a particular type of logic as to sort of how money flows and when money realizes. So it's a diverse bucket. Now that said, they all focus on one thing, which is getting results as the key focus. And so if you're going to focus on results, first it requires a strong sense of ownership from the drivers of policy change, from the drivers of implementation. So government in particular, sort of, when we talk about sort of national reform, governments have to be really fully on board with the types of change, the types of results that they want to see at the end of the day. And I think that this is a good thing. It really puts government in the driver's seat in the process of reform itself. Now, on the other hand, though, if you're going to finance the endpoint, it does introduce a level of uncertainty that makes everybody involved queasy. So, if I'm only going to sort of get money if I achieve X, Y, Z, I better make sure that I achieve X, Y, or Z, or otherwise the money does not realize. And so it does involve a level of risk that has to be managed. And one of the primary vehicles to manage this type of risk is by having clarity as to sort of what's the theory of change that underpins that reform process. And this is where evidence becomes absolutely critical. On one hand, there is technical evidence that needs to be teased out, sort of what types of interventions are best attuned to improving reading fluency or achieving automaticity in decoding graphemes or whatever it might be. So you have to have very, very specific technical knowledge as to how do you expect things to happen. And then secondly, you have to have good knowledge about the process in which these types of interventions are going to be played out. So both on the technical side as well as on the process side, clear evidence, clear theory of change become critical vectors under which to reduce the level of uncertainty in the process of change. Now, one of the advantages of results-based financing is because you're only financing the endpoint, it does give you room to adjust, to change, to adapt as things play out. In sort of more traditional investment projects, they're fairly sort of, everything is laid out ex ante, so you might have less degrees of freedom on how to change and to adapt if things don't work out the way you expect it to. Results-based financing approaches also do allow for a level of flexibility in different sort of types of geographical areas or dealing with different types of populations. So it does have built in a level of adaptability that might be more conducive to see changes in different ways along the way. Now, but sort of at the end of the day, though, sort of, again, it's again this marriage of technical knowledge with process knowledge that really makes implementation possible, and it really sort of requires a level of alignment between education systems to results. Again, so those results are usually dependent on a wide variety of stakeholders' involvement. So you need to have a curriculum that's aligned with standards, that's aligned with textbooks, that's aligned with sort of the type of teacher training and teacher professional development that's available, or it might relate to sort of how central level directives play out at the provincial level versus the district level, and sort of the different filters under which these policies go down to the school level. Sort of all of these, again, sort of a results-based financing approach is a conduit by which, sort of in many ways to force a systemic alignment so that you get everybody focused on a particular set of outcomes or outputs. And now, so just to also circle back to the notion of evidence, if you're going to finance results, obviously you need to know the sort of ex ante, so what's the theory of change, what's the process that you're going to undertake, but at the end point, you also need proof that those results have been achieved. So again, there's a big emphasis in results-based financing approaches on data collection systems that are robust, that are credible, and that are feasible, that are practicable. Oftentimes we see lots of education management information systems that expect to collect all kinds of data, but at the end of the day, they don't. So again, the results-based financing, by having this focus on data, provides an opportunity for the establishment of robust data collection mechanisms that hopefully will provide a feedback loop and will continue sort of to feed us to sort of what works and how it works and why it hasn't worked in the education reform process. Thank you.
Thank you. So a great set of different points that have been raised by our panellists, and I think sort of Luis is throwing out both some innovative approaches, but also some potential challenges. I think DFID has had a lot of experience of quite a large program, the Girls' Education Challenge, that has been based on payment by results, and I think there's some lessons to be learned from that. So, as we were hearing, the Tanzania Big Results Now, which has some evidence, but again, the RISE program is going to be linking up with more evidence. So I think this link between evidence and these types of approaches is really crucial, as Luis was saying. What I suggest is you've been sitting there very patiently, have 2 minutes of just buzzing with each other, literally 2 minutes, and in the meantime, anyone on the live stream who wants to send a tweet for a question, then please do so, and then we'll come back with questions for the panellists. So just turn to the person next to you and say what you thought was interesting, what you had a problem with.
I thought what you said was interesting, Rachel.
So we will start with people in the room. I'll take a cluster of questions. So if those at the front here want to be ready to answer the ones that you want to answer, ready to answer those ones you want to answer, and I'll provoke you on the ones that you haven't answered. So opening it up. There was lots of noise and now it is silent.
Keith,
Peter, is there a need for a... We've got a microphone at the back.
I think Keith wants to give you that.
Okay, so we've got Keith, and then here.
Introduce themselves.
Yeah, and if you could just introduce yourself, Keith, and say where you're from if you want to. Oh, okay.
Can I start? Oh, it is. Okay, thanks. My name's Kat Thorne and I work for the Commonwealth Education Trust, so you might have heard of us. We have professional development courses in the form of massive open online courses, and they're currently on Coursera, and you know the vision behind those was that they were there to help develop teachers in the Commonwealth who had little or no education or professional qualifications. From what I've seen from the people who are actually taking those courses is they're not actually targeting those teachers that really need it. They're actually targeting teachers who are already well educated, and so we have a challenge in that we have this fantastic opportunity to reach teachers in some of the countries you've been talking about. But I'm just interested to hear from your experience and your research, you know, how can we enable those teachers to get access to this information? Because that is our goal, you know, and we have it available online. You know, it can be financially, it can be funded through financial assistance, or where projects can pay for it also. But you know, we have a challenge in how do we get that to those end people, a bit like you were saying, you know, that you can talk to educational ministers, but does the finance and the information go further? I just wondered if you could offer any thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can hear whether that's part of the education workforce agenda. So if you could pass the microphone to Keith.
Thank you. Keith Lewin from the University of Sussex. I think we should all welcome this report, and it's a fantastic piece of work, and it keeps the profile of the issues in front of people in a way which is increasingly important. What are my observations? Well, first, Elizabeth, you were asking for a reflection on some of the history. When we first did these estimates of how much it would cost to reach the EFA goals, in 1990, it was about 5 billion. By Dakar, it was about 10 billion. At the time of the Secondary Education in Africa programme, it'd probably gone up to about 12 to 14. And it's now, depending on which version, it's 60 billion, I think is your figure, maybe even 90, depending on...
Yeah, depends which year or averages.
Yeah. Okay, this is a huge amount of money. It's actually, in tank terms, that is the cost of a tank, the cost of an aircraft carrier, a military analogy, pretty much the same. The inflation has been pretty similar to military inflation. I think it's very interesting in your report that you talk about energy subsidies, but you don't really do what we tried to do in 1990, which is say, look, if you're a country that's got more soldiers than teachers, you've got a problem. It is military budgets, not energy budgets, that really screw you up, and they also kill people, and they're intended to. So I think that's one useful thing that you could return to and say, well, where are these countries with more soldiers than teachers, and why is it still true? Number one. Number two, an observation. Although it may be true that health has successfully captured a lot more philanthropic interest and bilateral assistance, it's not true that most poor countries spend more on health than education. The opposite is overwhelmingly true, often twice as much. So there's some disjunction here that needs explaining. Why is it the international community is so keen on health, but 54 countries in Africa are actually not so keen on health as they are on education as a public good? And I know you're going to shut me up, so I'll make the final 2 points, which I really think are important. Because these amounts of money create dependence. The first rule of development is don't create dependence. Dudley Sears said this about 30 or 40 years ago, and it's true. If you do 11 or 12% of GDP on education, which is your low country estimate, First of all, of these 62 countries in the GPE, more than half of them receive more than half of their government budget from international finance already. If you increase that, you create dependence. You break that rule, which is don't create dependence. You also break the rule of sustainability. So the report, I think, is very thin on explaining how if you did these things, you would continue to do these things. Undoubtedly, if you're paying half the government budget, you are paying teachers' salaries. And when you stop paying that, you will be firing those teachers. Mm-hmm. You will create instability and the next generation of fragile states. So please don't do it. And the burning question I have left in my mind is which secondary school did Donald Trump go to?
None.
I cost private school, no doubt. What did he learn? And he believes in dependence, quite obviously.
So we'll see who has the answer to that question. So, yeah, Gareth.
My name is Garrett. I'm a student here in the MPhil program. Thank you for the very interesting conversation. It's exciting to see how much movement is being made on these topics and issues. I think if I had to summarize a sort of key takeaway from the conversation that the Commission is trying to generate around the concept of the learning generation, it would be that equitable and inclusive access to education as a means to then accessing the market and market opportunities will have a trickle-down impact on the rest of the most pressing issues facing developing countries. And to some extent I get that. I understand that this is the dominant dynamic of discourse. And I get that the Commission is a financing initiative. When you want money, you talk money. But on the other hand, I wonder in that you position the Commission as the sort of plow for the conversation about education at the highest levels of global politics. What can we do to broaden, sort of put forward a conception of education that is broader than a market pathway or a concept of education as simply being about making sure young people have access to market and market opportunity? I'm thinking of the way in which the SDGs do a good job of bringing in other key topics that go beyond socioeconomics but focus on social outputs and cultural outputs.
Mm-hmm. Some small questions here coming up. Yeah, Kwame.
Thank you very much, Kwame Acham from Sussex University. Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was really focusing on some of the big questions and issues that we need to be confronting. I just want to put a question or make a contribution to what DFID is doing. And one is that how is it engaging with the state sector in terms of the evidence that it produces? Because I think it's one thing producing the evidence. It's another thing what you do with the evidence. And I'm talking about within the state sector, who are we talking to? Who are the people who actually are the movers and the shakers? And what are the assumptions behind the way they work? Because I've had the opportunity to work with people, a lot of people in the ministries in Ghana and the district. And often they work on very different assumptions about change. And even if when the minister or the ministry has an agenda that is all well and good, they do not, it's not that they resist it, but it's when everybody has left the room, what happens to these people, and how do they translate the evidence and use that evidence? And I think it would be very good for us to bring that into the into the whole learning generation issue about who these people are, what assumptions they work in, what's the political environment in which they work in. And I think it would be good if DFID, in terms of, I know that you're doing work in supporting systems, but I think we need to broaden that understanding, because I have a feeling that often we are not identifying who these people are. Who are we talking about when we talk about government, ministries, ministers? and what are the assumptions behind the work. So I think that would be something that I would like to say. And just one last thing about the evidence, about qualitative evidence. I think that there is the issue about how you use also qualitative evidence. Because when you have that big evidence, how do you translate it in a system like education, which is very complex, and in many countries is very varied. It's just very, very complicated to say, okay, this is how things work. But when you go into the system, you have a very complex system. And how do you use that evidence within that complex system? So I think it would be something to bring into the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. A good set of questions. Okay, we'll take one more question in this round, and then we'll allow people to respond. Give you time to think about the answer.
Hello, my name's Alex McGrath from King's Ely. I'm head of global development there. It seems to me that money is the driver. Money tends to be held in the hands of the few. There's a lot of focus on reaching into poorer or developed regions, and quite rightly so, about unlocking that human potential. But I spend a lot of my time dealing with private equity individuals or with governments looking at the private school market in their countries. And the question I'd like to really frame here is, most of the countries that are looking at their private systems to generate education for the wealthy, in China or Vietnam or Malaysia, in Nigeria, Dubai, and other areas of the GCC, I would love them to see that human potential, because they are desperate to diversify their economies. They're desperate not to have economies based on oil, especially. And certainly if you look at Sheikh Mohammed in Dubai, who does not have an economy which is based on oil, and who, if he doesn't have a diversified economy, and if he doesn't have a strong education system, is going to have one of the poorest countries in the Middle East. And he's aware of that, and he has a global vision. How do you manage to push the buttons of the leaders and the decision makers in those countries so that they can see that potential? They can see the potential almost in a self-interested way for diversification of their economies by unlocking that human potential, so that you get that investment in those areas of the world that most need it.
Thank you. So I think a great set of quite diverse comments. I think I'd suggest just picking up on specific ones that you feel most energised to discuss, but we can continue discussing. And maybe start with Lisbeth, because most of them were to do with the report. And then Rachel on the one specifically for DFID, but it might also be relevant for other colleagues, but reflect on as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much to everyone here. These are really excellent questions, and I think each one of them could probably be the topic of an entire day of discussion. And I really, Keith, in particular, from you are obviously a giant in this field, and you've thought about this for so many years. And I agree with you on the military side. That is definitely a very sensitive topic. And what we used the example of the energy subsidies as a way where we could come together also when we think about the SDGs, because we have advocacy that's going around to try and address climate change. If those people are knocking on government's doors and trying to get them to reduce energy subsidies, that as part of that conversation we could bring in education. So the idea was also about where are the opportunities. Now, similarly, if there is a good effort around peace or reduction of military spending, I'm not sure which advocacy group that would be, but we were trying to also think concretely about what are the sort of the groups that we can lock into that can help us actually achieve things. But I agree with you. I mean, the military side it's highly complicated. It's very difficult, obviously, in countries where you have conflict and there is a real issue of security. I mean, that's sort of people needing to go to school, and then how do we make all those trade-offs? I don't think I have the right answer to that. I also agree with you that domestically health has been a lower spending item. What's interesting though with some of the analysis that we've done and I did in the past as well is that you see an upward trend. while education has been, I think it went from 9 to about 12% of the budget over the past decade, were the last numbers I think I looked at. Education is about 15% at the moment, but it hasn't been much movement. In fact, in some, on average, and in some countries, you see a sort of reduction, which is worrying. So we could actually see some kind of coming together. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I think what we also want to make sure is that we don't pitch health against education, because we need both of those sectors. I think the only thing is, if health has been successful in certain ways, let's learn from it as to how it is creating that attention. I get your concern about the low-income countries. I think the estimates we've made are, and I'm interested in the very early estimates you did. We looked at education at large, pre-primary, primary, secondary, and tertiary. That wasn't done by the GMR. The GMR went up to lower secondary, and then the final one, they included secondary. So we were actually looking at a bigger set of things. That 11% of GDP is all spending, including from governments, from the private sector, from the donors. So that's also another thing that we need to keep in mind. It is the spending that we estimate needs to happen if we want to achieve the learning generation, which is less ambitious than the SDGs. So the question mark becomes, are we too ambitious? Mm-hmm. So can we not ask those countries, should we say, sorry, we don't think you can spend so much, so let's scale down our ambition? Another thing we did was we included quite a lot of efficiency assumptions. So even at the tertiary level, if you were to expand tertiary education at the cost that we can find on average today, that number would be even bigger. So we've tried to think about in the future what kind of percentage, and this was difficult because we're looking into a crystal ball. In the future, how much of tertiary do we think is going to be delivered online or through different modes of delivery that can bring the cost down? So I think on the costing side, we are fairly conservative. And then on the domestic finance side, we try to say as much as governments can do, this is what we estimate based on historical and what the IMF is saying they can do in terms of expanding their tax base and increasing the budgets for education. This is as much as they can do. So we're left with this. Who's going to fill that? If it's not the donors, it's going to have to be the households. Or we have to give up on our objectives. I'd be interested to get your views on how we reconcile that, because we do need the resources, and I'm not sure where they're going to come from.
So I'm going to cut you short there, Elizabeth, so we hear from the others, because I wanted just one short round of final questions, and I think pass to Rachel now for the answer to Kwame's question, and then to other colleagues.
Can I also just very quickly to Catherine's question there, the challenge that you face with this linking up of very good innovative initiatives that are happening perhaps in the international realm, and how do you really ensure those get to the teachers or the users? I think one of the things that we're going to launch in a couple of months' time is an education technology initiative that has identified this as a real problem on many issues, trying to actually bring these suppliers together. And one of the things we'll do is have supplier events in Africa and Asia at the outset to try and enable people to talk to each other before they even have to put in proposals. So it is an issue that's one small solution, but we recognise the challenge. Kwame, big question, big challenge. Three things I would say. I think the first is that DFID has recognised the need for much better kind of political understanding, and we're now actually, as part of the RISE programme, trying to trial a political economy analysis, so that before any research actually happens, we go in and try and get a much deeper understanding of what are the drivers of change, who are the key players, where are the power points, where are the constraints. So that's happening in the RISE countries, and the RISE website will have that material once it's developed up. And we hope that the toolkit all the tools developed for that will then be useful and usable for others around the globe. Secondly, I think, well, as you know, I mean, you're leading work for us on the CBE initiative in Ghana. We do try very hard to get academics who have deep and respected relationships with decision makers and government and state level players. Nothing beats the trust and relationships of those who have had long connections in country. And that's not always easy, but in the 70 applications we had for RISE, for example, one of the key criteria were actually around making sure that the team, some members of the team, could demonstrate that sort of deep connection and respect with the policy environment. We're not always good at it, and we don't always get it right, but it's critical. And I think, thirdly, DFID are very lucky. I think we're one of the only bilateral agencies who have something called Evidence into Action, a dedicated team within our research division, whose job it is to think more deeply around how do we get evidence being used in the real world, if you like. And we need to rethink both the kind of who and the how we do this. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I had a personal experience when I was a anthropology researcher doing my PhD in a refugee camp, and there'd been a study by Save the Children Fund about the nutrition school feeding program, and it was showing that the children weren't really gaining weight, and so they were concluding that the mix of the supplementary food wasn't quite right because the children were getting the meal, they were getting the food, they were giving it out, they'd done all the observations. But I knew at 5 p.m. when the UN vehicles all drove in their convoys out of the camp, because I was living in a refugee hut for a year, I knew that supplementary food was being given to all of the people with high status in the camp, including myself. That supplementary food wasn't going to the young children who needed it. And yet, when that was told to the agencies, they didn't want to know. We're not good as donors of having our failings exposed. We're not good at learning and listening, and we need to do more of that.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So, Olav, any thoughts from you?
Maybe on the first question, I think on how to reach teachers and empower teachers, because I think that's very much what it's all about. And I think innovation can do a lot. That's something that really needs to be explored in terms of new technology. And on the last question, on sort of, since Norway is an oil-dependent country, and we are facing some challenges, but when I was in UNESCO, I had the privilege of getting some insight into the Middle East and participating on some panels with education ministers. And it was quite interesting because they were all focused on copying Ivy League, university, Western University and technology institutes, and I try to say that you should invest in quality teachers and things like that, but it was a very hard message to get through, that you need these things to happen before you can really get a benefit from these Ivy League institutions. But this very much also comes down to the question of equity and distribution and things like that. So it really illustrates the political nature of education.
Thank you, Olav. So I think we're going to give the last word to Louis, because I realise we know.
And maybe just to pick up on what Olav just said, if you want to look at an example where sort of the power of human capital as a force for social development and the importance of equity as a promoter of social and economic development, again, Singapore stands out. This is a country that's extremely resource poor. They don't have land, they don't have water, they don't have minerals. Their greatest resource is people, and they knew that from the very beginning, and their investment from early childhood education all the way to higher education sort of has benefited them tremendously. I think also just a comment on sort of evidence and evidence for whom. I think that we need to get much better at sort of how do we tailor messages and the use of evidence for different types of audiences. But I think that again, in recent years, there's a greater movement about sort of how social accountability and how sort of these bottom-up information approaches can be a huge force again to bring about social educational change. Enterprises like Pratham in India or Wezo in Eastern Africa all sort of point us to sort of how even using fairly complex technical instruments like a student achievement test that has to be psychometrically appropriate and rigorous, can be a vehicle to mobilize villages, community organizers, to focus on what is it that kids are learning or not, and then what they can do about that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great note to finish on. As I think here in Cambridge, we're also working very closely with the PAL network, ASA and Aweso, on this very issue of how to use the immense evidence that they are collecting, the learning assessment data, for action at the local level. And I think one of the big issues is about how we use it with policymakers. The other is how we actually use it for change within schools and communities. And so I'll leave that with that as our final challenge to go away and think about. So thank you again to our panellists for their excellent contributions, to all of you for your participation, and look forward to the continuing discussion and to hearing more about the big results now from the Education Commission. Thank you.
Join the learning generation.
And just one final big thank you to our colleagues in AV who've been doing a wonderful job at live streaming.